Real Agriculture presents Frontlines, Geopolitics Affecting Agriculture with Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments and Real Agriculture's Shaun Haney. Shaun Haney of Real Agriculture, joined by my co-host here. It is Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments. Hey, Jacob, how's it going?
Shaun, it's good to be back with you. I'm glad that nothing is happening in the world geopolitically for us to talk about. We're really going to have to scrape the bottom of the barrel.
Oh, no kidding. It's a bigger challenge is what are we not going to talk about to try to make this sure it's not 2 hours. Okay, I want to start with India, very much in the news right now, hosted the G20 summit. But coming out of that, some very interesting happenings as we saw last week in the House of Commons. Prime Minister Trudeau basically say that making these allegations that they have intelligence showing that the Indian government was involved in a homicide on Canadian soil, or some have called it an assassination. I want to put that aside for a second. I want to go back to India and learn a little bit more about the inner workings there. What should we know about Prime Minister Modi? What motivates him?
Well, before we get to Modi's motivations, the first thing we just have to say about India is this is a country of over 1 billion people. It has several, I forget how many languages the different regions and different states and stuff like that speak. Like, it is very hard to speak about India as one country. The thing that is so unique about Modi is that he's trying to make it a single country, and he's trying to basically upend the general prevailing political ideology of India since its independence from the British Empire, which was, we are multicultural, we are diverse, we are all of these things, and it's a big democracy, and it's a tent for everyone, and everyone gets along, and things like that. And that's not, I won't say Modi's against that. I can already hear his supporters saying, oh, here comes the white guy coming to criticize Modi. There's pros and cons to this. The thing you need to know about Modi is he's a Hindu nationalist. So he thinks that the fact that you're Hindu matters more than the language that you're speaking, than the caste that you're in, all these other things that, or your religion, all that stuff. Yeah. We're a Hindu country. And that's relatively true. I think if you look at the, I don't have the precise polling data at my fingertips, but I would guess that India is roughly 70% sort of Hindu from that point of view. But what's different about him is he's a Hindu nationalist. So he wants Hinduism to be the be-all, end-all of India. And again, that comes with some good things. The caste system is honestly a medieval, antiquated thing where you keep, undesirables and other and terrible positions and no social mobility just because of where they came from or who their ancestors were and things like that. Modi wants to obliterate all that. He understands that that is an obstacle to Indian progress, to India becoming a modern nation. The flip side is anytime you're you move towards this sense of majoritarian impulses in a country, it's the minorities that are going to suffer. So India's majority Hindu. It's also, like I said, 1 billion people. I think India has more Muslims living in it than almost any other Muslim country in the world, if not all of them. Wow. So you're 25% of the population that is Muslim. Well, they're the ones who are going to be on the short end. The Sikhs are another minority, and they're the ones that we'll probably talk about in this Canada, India spat as we get deeper into it. They're a minority. And in general, anytime you have a majority that is trying to remake a country in its image or say, no, the ism here, the motivating principle of the country is to protect this majority or this religion or this ideology, it's usually the minorities who hurt the most. So it's kind of a mixed bag there. But if you really just want the very simple, who is Modi? How is he different? What is he trying to do? He's a Hindu nationalist. He's the first truly powerful Hindu nationalist to lead India since independence.
Now, is it a democracy in the definition that the Western world would say it's a democracy, or is it sort of like a quasi-democracy that sort of use that as a bit of a shield for some more authoritarian kind of behavior? How do you describe that?
It's a democracy. Excuse me, as you can hear, I'm fighting through a cold. I know you are too, Shaun, so I apologize in advance if I'm giving you my Grammy Award-winning voice here. Look, it absolutely is a democracy. Democracies don't have to be liberal. The majority of people don't have to pick liberal ideas or embrace liberal principles and things like that. That's also, if you go back to the founding of, say, the United States of Canada and things like that, these were not, strictly speaking, democracies the way India is today. Everybody gets a vote in India. Speaking of my own country, in the United States, most people couldn't vote in the United States when the United States was founded. We sort of gave the franchise over many centuries as the country evolved to all these other people. But yes, very strictly speaking, India is a democracy. There's nothing nefarious about the Modi government and how it's come to power. And he is an incredibly popular leader. If you look at approval ratings for Modi, people like him. The majority of people like him. And that's why he keeps on cleaning up in elections. And it's why his BJP party keeps doing well. And the Indian opposition is flailing around looking for alternatives and can't seem to find anyone. So I would not cast any aspersions on India's democracy, but just because a country is a democracy doesn't mean that it's liberal. And this is a mistake we've been making in the West. I mean, probably since before 9/11, but the whole U.S. war on terror and the idea that we're going to build a democracy in the middle of the Middle East with Iraq, even though there's no principles of liberalism and separation of powers and respect for minority rights and freedom of speech and all these other things, it's very, very hard to say, okay, like just we've now waved the wand. You're a democracy. You're now also going to believe in all these other principles that go along with liberal democracy, but are not necessarily what the majority of people want.
Okay, that makes sense. You mentioned that India is a collection of a number of different backgrounds and regions, and Khalistan is I think I'm saying that correctly, is one of those that's factored into the situation with Canada. Can you give us a brief kind of background here so we can understand what is happening with those people and the conflict and being deemed terrorists by Modi, and then that'll kind of allow us to understand how we got to where we are potentially.
Yeah, I'll give you a very broad overview. If folks are interested in this topic, there's a book recently, I'm forgetting the author's name, but Midnight's Furies is the name of the book. And it is a very short, accessible book about India's independence and all the things that are still operative today that happened with that. And that goes to the India-Pakistan rivalry. It goes to the creation of Bangladesh. It goes to this, all these other things is there. And if you want to study Indian history, I mean, you could spend an entire lifetime studying this and you wouldn't get there. Khalistan, as you say, it's really just the idea that the Sikhs should have a homeland of their own. And it's not, I'm sure some of them will get mad at me when I'm talking here, at least from my understanding of history, there really isn't a precedence for this until roughly the middle of the 1800s. So the British come, they subjugate large parts of India. There is a group of Sikhs in the Punjab who create a Sikh empire for 50 or 60 years, and eventually the British destroy them in a series of wars, and they assert control overall of India, and they bring it into the empire itself. There has still, though, been a faction of Sikhs since that time that want to return to that golden age, that want to return to the Sikh empire of the past. This was the best time for Sikhs in general, and that's how it should go going forward. One of the reasons that there isn't an independent Sikh state is because when India became independent from Britain, religion was really the demographic that the British cared most about. So Pakistan, majority Muslim lands, that's why it sort of gets broken off, although it's more complicated than that. There were no parts of India where the Sikhs were technically a majority. So they reached like 40% or something like that in a couple of regions of the Punjab, but they weren't a majority anywhere. And so the British said, well, so we're not going to like put our weight behind an independent Sikh republic or anything like that. It's just going to be part of India, and India is going to work. Now, this sort of vocal minority of Sikhs who want this over time, this sort of rallying cry for, no, we want an independent Sikh state. It starts building up over time. It really reaches a crescendo in the 1970s, and especially the 1980s. And at this point, that faction gets powerful enough. They take over one of the holiest Sikh sites in the Punjab, and the Indian government, led by Indira Gandhi, sends Indian troops in and clears out the place. They kill one of these Sikh leaders. They put an end to this mini uprising in the 1980s. And in response, two of Indira Gandhi's bodyguards, who were Sikhs, assassinate her. And then you get riots, Hindu riots across the country. They kill thousands of Sikhs as the communities are going back and forth and fighting and things like that. And it's been simmering roughly since then, but you still have that very vocalized radical minority that thinks of this, no, we want to go back to this independent Sikh state. We don't want to be a part of India. And, the latest manifestation of this, and it wasn't directly this, but you might remember when India was pushing those agricultural reforms or those farmer reforms a couple of years ago, and there were those huge protests that Modi eventually had to bend to. The Sikhs led a lot of those protests. They were the ones who were angry about this. And you could sort of see there, okay, they don't want to be part of this. They don't like these reforms. You're now starting to impact on their livelihood. And I think that's where some of it got reanimated. And now you have it in the front lines again. But I think it's important to emphasize this is a minority of the Sikh population. And they're really, unless you want to go back to the 1800s, as far as I know, and anyone can reach out and correct me if you want, I've been doing a crash course on this myself over the past couple of weeks. There's not a whole lot of precedence here for sort of an independent Sikh state in that part of the world, because this part of the world has been so populous, so diverse, so dense. That really has always been a patchwork quilt of all these different principalities, even when it was ruled by particular emperors or particular empires.
So that brings us to the present. The prime minister stands up in the House of Commons and brings forth allegations that they have intelligence that some member of the Indian government or the Indian government itself was involved in the assassination of a Sikh, a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. It seems like this is pretty heavy stuff. What do we make of this allegation where the intelligence came from the Five Eyes Alliance, which involves a number of allied countries of Canada and the U.S. What do we make of this?
Yeah, so no matter what I do here, and I probably already have pissed off your listeners, but no matter what I say here, some of your listeners are going to be pissed off because, and I've already had this experience with some Canadians since this happened. Some of you hate Trudeau's guts and you don't think he can do anything possibly good or principled or anything like that. And some of you love Trudeau and think that all the people who hate Trudeau are absolute morons and country bumpkins who don't listen to anything. So I don't care about all that. I don't care to wade into that. Please don't interpret anything I'm about to say as supporting whatever your viewpoint is about Trudeau. I don't envy his position. He was in a very difficult position. I haven't seen the intelligence, so I can't evaluate it for myself. But I have to believe it was pretty convincing if he was willing to go out on a limb and say this. The other thing here is that this wasn't his first attempt to deal with it. He apparently tried to talk to Modi at the G20 about this issue. And the Indian government basically told him to screw off. They said, actually, no, you're the problem because you have been supporting all of these Sikh separatists and Sikh terrorists and things like that. So maybe you should do some self-searching and you should apologize to us. We have nothing to apologize to you for because we've done nothing. And even if we had done something, it probably would have been justified anyway. The trick here, though, for Trudeau is I don't see what publicly castigating India like this does for Canada's interest. Now, you can, whatever you think of Trudeau,
yep.
I think we can all agree that we don't want other countries assassinating nationals of our own countries on our own soil. That seems to be a bad thing and something you would want a leader to take a principled stand on. It might even be worth sacrificing the national interest or specific trade interest in order to make that point. Because do we want the entire world to become, Khashoggi getting dismembered in Istanbul and Belarus can just bring down planes with, folks who have criticized their regime, take them off the plane, put them back in the air. India can go around assassinating people it doesn't like. That's a very dangerous world to live in. But the flip side of that is when you go after India publicly like that, India and Canada have been working on a free trade agreement for months. They were finally making some progress on it. There was supposed to be a trade mission here in a couple of weeks, and that's done. And that's because India is way more important and has way more potential for Canada as a market than vice versa. For the Indians, it's like everybody wants to trade with us. We're the prettiest girl at the dance. Everybody wants to move away from China. We're the billion-plus people with the good demographics, and we're the democracy and everything else. So you want to lecture us and tell us what to do without responding to any of our concerns about Sikh terrorism? Okay, great. No trade for you, and we're not going to be happy with you, and that's sort of going to be that. So I think the questionable thing for Trudeau here is, was it worth standing up and doing this? Because you're not going to change India's behavior. I don't think you're going to get any real recourse from this. And all you really functionally have done, you've ruined the opportunity for Canadian farmers or for other parts of Canadian industry to benefit from closer ties to India. Now, again, I can make the case that maybe it was worth it. But that, unfortunately, whether you think Trudeau had good intentions or not, that is the practical impact of what he's done.
Yeah, and we saw UK Prime Minister Sunak come out very quickly after this and say, I'm paraphrasing, but, we're concerned, but we're still going to move ahead with potentially signing a free trade agreement with India from a UK perspective. Is they're dealing with Brexit and trying to have all these free trade agreements all over the place in kind of a let's make a deal sort of fashion. We did see, though, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in a presser last week, I think it was on Thursday, kind of go after, or I guess address this head on, saying, we've been talking to India. We've also been talking to the Canadians. I want to make very clear that this hasn't created a wedge between Canada and the U.S. I think that to me that's one of the Prime Minister Trudeau's not only hopes, but he really needs this chip. He needs support from the U.S. on this, because if they are left on a Canadian island on this, there is nothing but repercussions from an economic standpoint in trying to do business with India. Is that fair?
It is, and this is not the first time this has happened with Trudeau. It happened with the Saudi Arabia thing back in 2018. It happened with arresting the Huawei CFO. Of course, the United States behest, and we can make all the rule of law arguments and things like that. But this is where me as a geopolitical analyst, I'm always going to be biased from the point of view that I think interest-based foreign policy is probably going to get you where you want to go more so than ideologically based foreign policy. And you can see even the United States straining with this. India is the centerpiece of the United States Indo-Pacific strategy. If you want to push back against China, you want to open up new markets, you want new cheap labor, the United States has put a lot of energy and time and money into trying to build up a relationship with India. But you can't just sort of if you criticize them in this way, and maybe the United States was one of the countries that supplied some of the intelligence. There has been that insinuation in the media too. Yeah. And you're going to piss India off. You're going to send India right back into its non-aligned bubble. And India is going to say, well, we don't want to be aligned with anyone. And that's what India has been telling us, by the way, over and over for years. The translation of Modi's big signature economic policy is self-reliance. He wants India to be self-reliant in general. I don't know if you saw India's external affairs minister's speech at the UN. He was very much, he didn't call out this spat with the United States or Canada in particular, but he said, we are tired of countries invoking the rules-based order and just cherry picking when it suits them. Because when it came to vaccine diplomacy, or when it comes to climate commitments, or when it comes to food and energy security and things like that, these countries don't talk about the rule of law. But when it talks about a country like India fighting terrorism, suddenly we have to talk about the rule of law. I'm not supporting that point of view. I'm just saying that's what India is saying here right now. And the more you push them on this issue, the more you start to lose their support. And again, Saudi Arabia is a great country to think of in this context. The United States has a very, very close relationship with Saudi Arabia. That relationship frayed a little bit when he was a candidate then, now he's President Joe Biden, said some really not nice things about Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Right. Most of them were probably true. And he has since had a fist bump with him and he's made everything okay. But how can you be cool with a relationship with a regime like Saudi Arabia and then turn around and say, but we're not going to be friends with Iran, but Saudi Arabia is really, really bad. When you actually look at the actions of all these different regimes, like none of them are particularly comfortable in things like that, which is why I would always say interest is where foreign policy is probably going to be solved. And if you start trying to do the ideological thing, you just get caught in this never-ending circle. Another good example of this, and if you have any Indian listeners who are listening to this, they will hate the example I'm about to, or the distinction I'm about to draw. Not the distinction, the analogy I'm about to draw. Everybody in the West was upset about about China getting rid of one country, two systems with Hong Kong, saying, okay, we're getting rid of Hong Kong having its own system and things like that. When the Indian government got rid of Kashmir's special status and cut off the internet and sent in Indian security forces to Kashmir, it was crickets in the West. You didn't hear a thing. You didn't hear a thing because the West wants India. The West wants to be close to India, wants to paper over all of these, as we said, illiberal things, or these things where, that makes us a little bit uncomfortable and things like that. So we're experiencing some of that dissonance. And it's why, if you're going to make policy from an ideological point of view, I don't care what side you're on, if you're going up with India doesn't want ideology. India wants a bigger economy. It wants to be a stronger Hindu nationalist country. And if you come in their way, they're going to do their own thing. They're not going to respond to the sort of browbeating, you must be liberal, you must be virtuous. They think that that's a poison chalice.
Before we move on to something else, there's the allegation, obviously that's going to follow through, and we'll see where this ends up in the truth quotient. But how does this sit politically, domestically in India? Is there any indications at this point, or would people be upset about these allegations, or would this be like, attaboy, way to go? Where do the Indian people sit on this?
The narrative that Indian media and that the Indian government is pushing is that the people of India are with them. That external affairs minister speech that I quoted, I believe the headline from the Times of India was delivers a smackdown of the West at the UN General Assembly or something like that. Like, they're really pushing it on. But this goes back again to Modi being a Hindu nationalist. So it plays really, really well with the Hindu nationalist crowd. And it also plays with generations of Indian foreign policy officials who want to be non-aligned. They don't want to be part of a U.S.-led Indo-Pacific framework. They also don't want to be tied to the hilt of China. They think they're a billion-plus people and that they are one of the rising economies, and they want to be a center of gravity in and of their own right. So it does support those types of groups. But if you're a minority in India, and as we discussed, India has many, many minorities, this stuff should make you very nervous. Even if the allegations are untrue. And again, I haven't seen them, so I can't benchmark whether they're true or not. But if you've got, let's say for the sake of argument right now, and I'm giving a lot of benefit of doubt here, let's say that the allegations are not true. Let's say that these were vigilante Indians who went killing these Sikh radicals or whatever. That still shouldn't make you feel very good if you're a minority in India. So what, these vigilante Indians are going to come around and assassinate us because they think we're terrorists and things like that? And the Indian government, rather than sticking up for the minorities, is going to say, well, yes, these are terrorists. Like, we didn't do anything. But if we did do something, we would have been completely justified. Like, if you're a minority in India, it's a really, really uncomfortable position to be in. But those are not the people that vote for Modi anyway. And they don't have enough of a voice to prevent Modi from winning, which all does not equal liberalism. You have to have separation of powers. You have to have a cultural, societal agreement towards, hey, we're not just going to be the majority and punish the minority because they don't have the votes. We're all going to try and make things for the common and greater good. And the whole secret potion that Modi's used is, yeah, the common good is the Hindu nationalist good. So that works for 60 to 70% of the Indian population. That keeps you in power, but it also means disturbing things if you're in the minority.
Let's move on to Ukraine. We saw President Zelensky in the U.S. last week, also visited Canada. The Canadian visit has brought on a lot of controversy based on the invite list by the Speaker of the House and a potential requirement or push, I guess I should say, for him to step down. From Zelensky's point of view, the visit to the two countries, obviously asking for support, whether that be qualitative in just voice or substantive and quantitative from a money standpoint. I think the U.S. number was about $28 billion more on top of the $113 billion that has already been provided. Successful trip, or what was your take on it?
Well, first of all, qualitative support doesn't mean anything for Zelensky. He cannot put press statements into an artillery gun and fire it at Russian forces. Ukraine has been, and Ukrainian fighters, they have been more skilled and braver than every analyst I know of, including myself, thought they would have ever been. Remember, the United States, when the war started, took their embassy staff out of Kyiv. Nobody thought the Ukrainians were going to stick up for themselves this way. But all this is the success that they've had. They are still dependent on the West for weapons. And they are still dependent on the West for capital. They cannot produce their own weapons, and they're in it costs a lot of money to fight a war. And the thing that Zelensky is facing right now is, no matter how you look at it, polls across Europe, across Canada, across the United States, people are getting tired of the war.
Yep.
People are getting tired of the blank check. People are getting tired of hearing about it. They're tired of sending weapons. We're going into election season here in the United States. You've got a minority government in Canada, so in some sense, it's always election season until you get a majority government. Like, it's an issue that's going to play. And for Zelensky, his speeches, I don't think they're going to move the poll numbers. They're not going to tell people, hey, this is going somewhere. Now, he can buy himself time by securing promises and support from leaders. So no matter what the poll numbers look like, I don't think Biden is going to leave Ukraine hanging high and dry. He's committed too much to that. And I think he really believes that it's his job to support Ukraine. I would imagine that Trudeau sort of feels the same way. From that point of view, probably good for Zelensky to go and say, hey, we need this. I need to put the pressure on you. These are the things that I need. But in the sort of longer term, over the next 2 to 3 years, he's got elections in the United States. He's got poll numbers that are flagging across the West. He's supposed to be facing elections in Ukraine here in the next year or so, which is a whole sort of Pandora's box as well. So the real thing that Zelensky needs to do is he needs to show show success with the counteroffensive. And I don't think it was a coincidence that in the last couple of days, the Ukrainians has been saying, oh, we broke through some Russian defenses, and it's only a little bit, but we're on the way, and we need to get to this city. And the greatest thing would be to get all the way to the Sea of Azov so that we can cut off Russian supply lines to Crimea. And that, I think, really is where this is going to be judged. Ukraine has to cut off Russian supply lines to Crimea. If Russia continues to control Crimea, if this is going to be a war of attrition, and 3-4 years from now, we're having the same conversation on the podcast, Russia has the upper hand because Russia is going to outsuffer us. They're going to deal with more suffering than the rest of the West and the Ukrainians are going to deal with. They have more people. They have an authoritarian regime, all those other sorts of things. So it's nice that Zelensky got his promises. It's nice that he got his billions. It's good for him to, rally around the flag. But it's much more important for him to make some tangible progress than, like I said, in cutting Russia off from Crimea. If he can do that, we're in a very, very different world, and Ukraine is in a much stronger position.
I want you to flush some out for me. I mentioned the Canadian House Speaker, Mr. Rhoda, who is facing mounting political pressure to resign as Speaker, as he invited apparently a 98-year-old man, according to the Globe and Mail, who fought with the Nazi unit during the Second World War. Yaroslav Hunka was his name, and he was honored Friday during the visit by Ukrainian President Zelensky. And parties of all sides are asking for the speaker to resign. And we've heard Putin talk about, hey, this war is really about trying to flush out Nazis in Ukraine. Talk about kind of where does Nazi fit into this puzzle of this simple, what's made out to be a simple war between Ukraine and Russia? Can you flesh that out for us?
Yeah, I mean, we could spend hours on
I know.
this,
I simplified the question, but just, yeah.
No. It's an important question. So we got to go back in history a little bit. So the version of history that we're taught in sort of the history books about World War II is that the Nazis tried to take over the world. They allied with Japan, and then eventually the Allies came through. It was the United States and Great Britain and even the Soviet Union. They all combined to try and fight against the Nazi menace and the Japanese menace, and they won. Problem is that only really starts in 1940, 1941. There were years of warfare before that. And if you go back to sort of the original, what should I say, the original rival of communism was not necessarily capitalism. It was National Socialism, which is now what we call Nazism. And the Nazis and the communists all hated each other. They were all on opposite sides here. And that was why it was such a big deal that Hitler and Stalin had that temporary pact, even though both of them were planning to stab each other in the back. It was just that Hitler stabbed them in the back too. And when you're talking about the fighting in Eastern Europe at this time, yes, like there were sort of anti-communist partisans that were supporting either their own ethnic groups or maybe they were part of the larger Nazi war machine. And then you also had, communist partisans who were fighting against the National Socialists and fighting against the Nazis. And all of this gets really, really, really messy. So you can imagine a world in which, yes, you could probably pluck a Ukrainian out who was fighting Soviet forces around the time of World War II. And if you didn't know any history at all, and you just, he fought the communists, that must play well. Well, who did he fight the communists for? He fought them for the National Socialists, because before we get the Allies win and everything like that, it was the National Socialists and the communists hated each other. So really, that Speaker of the House, he just needs a better research staff. And if he's listening to this, we do this all the time. Happy to help you with your research and make like this is very, very easy due diligence for me. I'll give you a really nice rate. I'll also, let me just put some biases on the table here, because I think it's always important to put biases on the table. My grandfather was born in what is today Ukraine. It was Poland for a while. He was a Jew. He fled the Nazis and things like that. He eventually fought for the French army. So this is like intimately personal for me. Like all the stuff that we're talking about, there's been a lot of self-righteous indignation. How could you salute this guy? Literally, my ancestors were the ones who died in this fighting the people went at them. So, I don't know. He's 98 years old. It was a long time ago. I hate the way this stuff just sort of gets used as a political totem back and forth. And that's from somebody who actually has skin in the game with this one. Yeah.
So I was in a tweet thread, which can be dangerous sometimes.
Very dangerous.
But
an X thread, an X
thread. Sorry, thank you very much. It was some Real Agriculture listeners asking each other. I think it started out. Can we really afford to keep providing support to Ukraine? And it sort of developed into a pretty good constructive discussion about what's happening. And one of the guys asked, is there not like a peaceful, is there any way that there's a peaceful resolution to this, or is that just completely off the table at this point? And so I thought, hey, you're a good person to ask. What about a peaceful, the U.S. and Europe bringing these two sides together? Is there any willingness to do that?
I'll allude to, she's now former Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin, who is her own sort of controversial personage. But somebody asked her this question, is there not a peaceful solution? Shouldn't we be pushing for a peaceful solution? And she said, yes, there absolutely is a peaceful solution. Russia can go back to its borders before the war started and we'll have peace. And that's the answer to your question. If the Russians want to stop attacking these positions, there will be peace. There has been and will be interest in the United States, in Europe, probably even in Ukraine, for a negotiated settlement if it involves Ukraine getting its territory back or most of its territory back. I think you could maybe open up a conversation about Donetsk and Luhansk. But as long as Russia's going to control Crimea and say they're the ones that are going to control ingress and egress for the Black Sea for Ukraine ships, Ukraine can't stand for that right now. And that's their territory. It's their sovereign territory. So the answer to your question is that Russia has shown no willingness to sit down at the table and reach a negotiation that would satisfy anybody's desires here. And I would point you to French President Emmanuel Macron, who thought like this for years. He thought he was going to be the one to have a negotiated settlement. He wanted France to play the mediating role, things like that. And literally for the first, 14, 16 months of the conflict, this is what he was pushing the French government to do. And he was putting pressure on Zelensky, and he got a lot of flack for going and talking to Putin and things like that. And actually, France, in just the last couple of months, has done a 180. They've said, you know what, this Putin guy was just taking us for a ride the whole time. He didn't mean any of it. So now we think that Ukraine has to fight this war until it wins, or until the Russians are so exhausted that they can't do anything anymore. And I think that's the other scenario here, where maybe, what would a peaceful solution looks like? Probably looks like Putin being deposed by the oligarchs or by a popular revolution, and the Russian people standing up and saying, we've had enough. We supported this guy because he was supposed to give us prestige on the global stage and a good economy and political stability, and we don't have all three right now. So let's get rid of him, and let's get someone in power, and let's get back to good relations with the West. But until Russia decides, like, Russia was the aggressor. Russia was the one that invaded. If Russia wants to go back to the pre-war boundaries, this war can end tomorrow. That's the answer to your question.
It's a high-stakes game. I'll finish up with this. You mentioned the oligarchs. With all of the restraints that were put on economic transactions with Russia, and we're seizing oligarch boats and airplanes. There's a big Russian cargo plane at the Toronto airport, that massive plane that is basically still behind a gate. There was a lot of talking heads talking about how, hey, the oligarchs are going to take care of Putin for us. That has totally died down. What of the oligarchs? It seems like that's a pretty bit much a quiet stream at this point.
Not so quiet.
Okay.
Because let's not forget Prigozhin, the caterer-in-chief turned head of the Wagner Group, literally marched on Moscow with his fighters and was shooting Russian helicopters down, and he was halfway on the highway to Moscow before he turned around and said everything was fine. So he's not sort of an OG oligarch, if you will. He was grandfathered in. But Putin has surrounded himself and enriched all of these oligarchs. So if you're a Russian oligarch right now, you have been empowered and enriched by Putin himself. He has surrounded himself with a coterie of folks who are completely dependent on him and who owe their allegiance to him and things like that. And they don't gain right now from getting rid of him, it seems. But don't forget that Prigozhin incident. That was really weird. That was a mutiny against the entire system. And Prigozhin didn't get the support that he thought he did. It looks like he only got one major general. I'm forgetting I'm not forgetting. I actually can't pronounce his name because I don't remember off the top of my head, but he was the Air Force guy. He was the general of the Air Force, and he's since been removed. He was the only guy who committed with him, and none of the oligarchs looked at Prigozhin and said, that's the guy, we're going to go with him, or we're ready to overthrow Putin here and have someone to replace him. So things have not gotten bad enough for the oligarchs for them to think that they need to throw Putin overboard. And it's nice that we can talk about, okay, maybe we've detained a yacht here and there or an airplane here and there. Most wealthy Russians are either enjoying themselves inside Russia, or they're running around Dubai, or maybe they're running around Istanbul if they really have means. Maybe they're in Singapore, maybe they're in Tunisia. I don't know. They're places where wealthy Russians can go and flaunt their money and things like that. So the situation has not gotten so bad for the oligarchs that they have seen yet that they need to throw Putin overboard. But I do think, and I stick to this analysis, I think that Prigozhin mutiny was the beginning of the end. Now, does that mean that Putin falls in the next year? It wouldn't surprise me. But here I would also go back to history. Tsar Nicholas helped prosecute a war against Japan in 1904 and 1905 when it was the Russian Empire. Japan completely destroyed Russia, humiliated them on the global stage. It was actually the United States. I think Teddy Roosevelt won a peace prize for this, if I'm not mistaken, for negotiating the peace between Japan and Russia. And it was the beginning of the Japanese Empire. Tsar Nicholas lasted for another 12 years. He had to create the Duma. He had to give more power to the people and things like that. But he lasted long enough to where he was still the Tsar. He helped start World War I. He fought World War I for 2 years, and millions of Russians died in that fighting before the Russian people finally rose up and said, enough is enough. We're getting rid of the Tsar. So could we look back into history? Let's try and transport ourselves 100 years from now. Would it surprise me at all if Putin in 10 years is deposed by some rising revolutionary who unites the Russian people against him, or by some oligarch and things like that. No, you would draw a direct line between the Russia-Ukraine war and Prigozhin all the way back. You say, 10 years later, sort of Putin fell. So there's time for this to happen. These things don't sort of happen very suddenly. And I will say that Putin does seem to have consolidated his control for right now. I know I'm rambling, but the last just thing that I would sort of put in your listeners' minds about this is don't forget about what's happening in the South Caucasus with Armenia and Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, because that is connected to all this too. Armenia is supposed to be a client state of Russia. Azerbaijan and Turkey have a very close relationship. Turkey has been saying Russia's supposed to come back to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Putin keeps saying, nope, I'm not coming back to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Is it a coincidence that suddenly Azerbaijan is taking over territory from Armenia and making the Russians look completely weak because the Russians are so bogged down in Ukraine that they can't go and support their defense treaty ally, Armenia, in that war? Now you've got tens of thousands of Armenians who lived in Nagorno-Karabakh streaming towards Armenia, refugees in a really grisly situation that's happening there. Russia was also the dominant power in Central Asia, the dominant power in the Western Balkans. All of that is changing too. So when you start to look around the world at Russian power, it's receding, it's unstable. Doesn't mean that Putin's going to fall imminently, but I wouldn't be so comfortable if I was him. And my bet, at least right now, my analysis right now is we've already seen the beginning of the end. And this process can last a long time. And the people who will suffer are the Russian people and the people in Nagorno-Karabakh and all those other people. But I think we've seen the beginning of the end of Putin. I don't know how he continues to rule when he's got caterers coming for his lunch meat.
Incredible, high stakes, real life game of risk. It is absolutely amazing, fascinating, and obviously all of this comes back to the farm gate at some point or another. Jacob, really appreciate the analysis and the thoughts and the breakdown and shedding some light on some of these topics, India and Ukraine today. Thanks so much. Until next time, we'll talk to you later, bud.